Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have Steve Montgomery, the author of The Converging Apostasy and A Quick Outline of Hands-on Eschatology, A Matter of Timing and Agency. And together, we're examining the themes of apostasy in the New Apostolic Reformation and its history. Steve, it's a good day. I mentioned this the last time we recorded, that the new book was on its way and would probably be released before or soon after the last podcast. And I think the last podcast went out and the new book is now out, Weaponized Religion from Christian Identity to the NAR, in English. And as of this weekend, I have taken a note from the playbook of Charles Paisley, and I've got a French version coming out. I think the Kindle is already out as of now in French, and soon the Spanish version will be coming out. So I have published my first French and Spanish book, which is kind of funny considering I don't speak either, but there are tools that Charles showed me how to use that magically now I have my book in French. And anyway, it's out, and all of the Christian identity stuff, it doesn't cover the apostasy stuff. You'll need to get Steve's book, but the part that I usually navigate towards, the Christian identity stuff, you can find the entire history of it in this book, dating back, far before Pentecostalism, all the way up into the NAR.
Yeah, well, John, that's really intriguing and great to hear that you have that new book out. I'll be looking forward to getting a copy of it. The part about having it in other languages, I think you really have to focus on putting it in Hindi. And once you've got that in Mandarin, I think you'll be set. So speaking of being set, what I kind of set my eyes on for today is, I guess, what people would call pseudo-intellectuals and propagandists that maybe are behind the scenes, pulling strings and influencing others, like the populists do the grunt work, and they set the stage for the doctrines and the like I said, pseudo-intellectual backing. So in the past, I've been focusing a lot on the action of a sacred purge through the ideas of disciples of Jane Lead in the Latter Rain movement of 1948, and those that they influenced in the current day NAR. So it's not just something that's, deep in the past. Jane Lead, yes, 17th century prophetess, but her influence on the 1948 prophets is then evident in the NAR today. So also, I think we've touched on this quite a bit, is similar actions can be found, or a promotion of the sacred purge, through disciples in the New Age, primarily through Alice Bailey's writings. But also you can see it through a host of others, but she's so influential, I just focus on her. So today, like I said, a new category, sort of new, is to look at the pseudo-intellectuals that essentially have the idea, the ones I'm going to look at, of joining together with the goal of making Russia and USA great again. Sounds strange to many ears. Yeah, it did to me too when I heard it. So how are they going to do this? Well, they have, there's a group of folks that call this accelerationism. So what they mean is they will be accelerating their aligned in-time order of events by sowing chaos and creating political tension. Oddly enough, I saw I don't recommend this movie, but I saw it advertised. It's called Wild in the Streets, and this is 1968. Have you heard of that one, John?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, so it's essentially some disgruntled young hippies that feel like they need to be in charge of things, and the old fogies are not fit to do this anymore. So rather than go politically, they decide to put LSD in the water. And so And so they corrupt everybody's minds and take over. So it's a pretty lame story as far as the movie and the acting goes. But there's this this behind the scenes sort of thing. So what I would focus on in this group is the pseudo-intellectuals like Helena Blavatsky, John Lamb Lash, Julius Evola, Alexander Dugin, Steve Bannon, and Nick Land. So I'm pretty sure that a lot of folks have not heard of all those names, but we'll get to them. They all seek to fuse spiritual, political, and even scientific means to accelerate the downfall of society and replace it with a new order. And that's expressed in many different ways. So what is accelerationism? I aim to answer this question as best I can based on several articles and YouTube videos. I'm not going to give all of those, but a couple of them. Here's an article that I thought was useful. It's called Accelerationism, the obscure idea inspiring white supremacist killers around the world. How a techno-capitalist philosophy morphed into a justification for murder. And that's by Jack Beauchamp, 2019. And then another one, the title's pretty bizarre, but Accelerationism, Amphetamine Philosophy, and the Death Trip by Jules Evans, and that's 2023. Then also, I know that we came up with this name last time, but I think this is odd, but also strangely appropriate, is that accelerationism is also discussed and promoted by a blogger named Azazel.
There's a lot to unpack there, but it made me go back and think of all of the different weird facts that I've uncovered in my research, not all of which I've published, because some of it edges really close towards conspiracy theory, which I avoid altogether because it can brand you as publishing inaccurate information. However, MK Ultra, there is enough documentation out there that is factual. And even though the term conspiracy theory was made to literally throw up a distraction away from this, the government, the United States government, put LSD on the streets in an attempt to stop a civil rights war, basically, because of the Christian identity stuff that we've been talking about. So there was an actual plot to put LSD on the streets, but it was staged by the United States government. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, which is interesting, in Latter Rain, a lot of people who are disconnected don't realize this, but the Christian identity themes that birthed Latter Rain included the Jewish conspiracy, the thought that there were false Jews that were intent on taking over the world, global domination. Well, there was a Russia component and a Rome component that merged into that when when Christian identity became the very racist, violent thing that it transitioned into. And so the LSD being put onto the streets was the government's attempt to stop what these racists were claiming was an impending race war, and which was actually developing because of the racists. So it was, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But that is, believe it or not, that is the world that I grew up in. We were taught that there would be a Russian threat to the United States, and it would come at the time in which there was a female president, and then the entire world would be utterly destroyed. So if you look at what's happening today with the with the two candidates running for president and the events that are happening in Russia, I'm sad to say that in the cult that I escaped, there is a tremendous amount of fear because they believe this is the scenario for the end of days, and it is a history that has repeated itself because back in the 60s they thought the same thing, which is why they think this today. It's the same cult, just a different decade.
Yeah, John, that's really amazing. It's like you're reading my notes here, what I prepared to talk about, because a big component of it is is these pseudo-intellectuals that really are trying to, stoke a race war. And so that goes to the left, that goes to the right. And the idea of a Jewish conspiracy, the deep state, and there's folks behind the scenes, the elders of Zion, etc., and the civil rights issues that you're discussing. So the next thing I was going to point out is sort of what you're talking about there in a big way, is that accelerationism sort of draws a line in the sand, but instead of saying you guys on the right wing or you guys on the left wing are counted out, they have pseudo-intellectual backing to say we're both in the same game. So it's kind of a twist on what you're saying, but I found it interesting that folks on the left and the right that are part of this accelerationist idea, they both desire to destabilize and take over all existing systems. So where have you heard that before? It's like the NAR 7 mountains. And for them, it also includes education, religion, and government, then some other categories. So as a result, both forms of accelerationism desire rapid changes in society by any means necessary. This means that the best things for them that leftists and white supremacists can do is to accelerate, as they put it, discord, death, and destruction. In this sense, their actions are pretty much like starting a fire with an accelerant, like, say, gasoline. So who started all this kind of stuff? Well, like a lot of your research, it's very hard to pinpoint one person. But people who have kind of been observing this movement say that this fellow named Nick Land he's been described as the godfather of accelerationism. So what about him? He co-founded the Cybernetic Culture Research Institute, or unit rather, aka the CCRU. And it sounds like a NASA group, but they like to put words that way. They were a research group of intellectuals that mixed technoscience, scientific racism, as if there's something that actually exists. And John, I know you've mentioned this a lot. They also are actually into science fiction. So, and then as I was reading about it, just came to my mind, no, please, not again, but yes, again. They also dabbled in the occult. So the intellectuals, sure, they're highly educated, got a high IQ, but they seem to think the occult is a way to go to learn. So to be more specific, what do I really mean by saying that they dabbled in the occult? Well, one is that they followed some of the ideas of Nazi eugenics that were based on the occultist Helena Blavatsky's theosophy. As far as Blavatsky's theosophy goes, it sought to compare the study of religion, philosophy, and science. Even though they had some really wacko religious ideas, they tacked in there the science component. And here we go again. Oddly enough, the CCRU that Nick Land was a part of moved into the home that was formerly owned by the Satanist Aleister Crowley. And so while they were in his home, they practiced what they thought were rituals to call down demons. These demons reportedly told them the secrets about Lemuria and the Lemurian tradition that supposedly contained everything that was and will be. Well, having read a lot of Jane Lee's stuff and other similar sorts of writers in the Manifest Sons of God movement, is very similar to their idea of a conscious pre-existence. And so you can hear this through one of her disciples in the latter rain, Royal Cronquist. He says that there are revelations that came before Genesis 1. Also, David Ebal, very tight with Bill Britton. Ebal talks about the volume of the book, which contained these pre-existent, pre-Genesis 1 ideas. So you might have heard this also from Wesley Swift, but this runs parallel to his ideas about creation, uh, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Well, he wasn't the only one that taught that. You can also hear George Houghton, one of the guys that really got the lettering started in 1948. And numerous other manifest sons of God teachers talk about this stuff. Oddly enough, it's also like the occultist Helena Blavatsky and Edgar Casey's Akashic record, this thing, the tapping into the secret knowledge of the universe, which mostly ends up being a lot of hooey, but also can have angles to it, like the racist ideas and that we will be gods and take over, that kind of nonsense. So, fifth in this connection of ideas coming from land that essentially would be designated as a cult, was that the CCRU also were fascinated with Kabbalistic numerology. So again, tying this into Manifest Sons of God latter rain teachers who influenced the NAR, who was also interested in this would be George Warnock, Bill Britton, Roel Cronquist, David Ebal, and lo and behold, there he is again, Franklin Hall.
And William Branham, who spearheaded the movement, also believed that there was a race prior to Genesis. He said that he believed that there was another civilization that existed before, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but the people had hands like a monkey and tail like I don't know exactly what he said, but what he's essentially referring to is the mud people that Wesley Swift was teaching. They were all teaching the fact that there was this race that pre-existed Genesis, and it was the devil's kingdom, and God planted the humans that were the white race, and then, the history there, it's still science fiction, but they have a historical version of science fiction. But where it gets interesting is they brought in later the UFOs, so they brought in the futuristic science fiction with the prehistoric science fiction. But I grew up with that too, but it was largely diminished. All of the leaders in Branhamism today, many of them had to have been aware that it was teaching the Wesley Swift doctrines, and I strongly suspect that the elders talked among themselves, but to the average person who's hearing it, it's been scrubbed from the recordings, and they don't really, except for the phrases they've missed, you don't really find it so much. But it developed into a very horrific thing in the 60s, because they literally thought that people who had dark skin came from mud people and that they were less than human, which is not a Christian way to live by no means. And that's how it developed. But where it gets interesting is when you take those themes, those racist ideas and racist themes, and consider the fact that they're merging in Gnostic ideas, mysticism, and creating almost a futuristic Lord of the Rings style end of day scenario. And if it were a movie or a book, it might be one that I would read, but I'm not really interested to hear it in my church, and that's the problem with this. They were saying these things in the churches.
Yeah, John, no kidding. That's amazing what has transpired as being Christian doctrine, and of course, there are fruits of that. And so, as far as this guy Land, well, he has fruits of his influence. Here's a couple of items I would mention. Since 2016, Land's so-called dark enlightenment has been recognized as an inspiration for far-right movements like the alt-right, which, of course, Steve Bannon has had great connections with. And then it would take too long to discuss that. But then if you take Steve Bannon's connections and who's affiliated with in the NAR, then you can see there's these strings attaching all different directions, and that's where the influence can transpire. Okay, so here's some example of the fruits of Land's influence on white supremacist violence. They include the murder of a young gay man who's named Blaze Bernstein, the terrorist attack on Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue, the attack on mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, and the shooting at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas.
Right. That's exactly the point I was stressing earlier. Whenever you take something that is so anti-biblical and then mix it with people who have a leaning towards extremism, they're going to take it out to very extremist ideas. And modern examples of things that can go wrong, I've mentioned in the book, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but in the NAR world today, you have Mike Bickle, who was the leader of IHOP KC, saying things like Jesus likes bloodshed. I can't remember the exact quote. You'd have to go get it from the book. But he's saying things like this, which, if I were to hear his entire sermon in context, I'm still going to say it sounds bad and sounds awful, but to the people listening, they probably thought that it wasn't so bad that he said this, and I'll probably get people who are defending that statement. But the problem is, if there's anybody in the audience who has any mental health issues, or if they are inwardly an extremist, they could take this out to levels far beyond what Bickle ever intended to say. And that's really the problem with these kind of statements. I think early on in Christian identity, they never really anticipated that they would almost create a race war, but they did. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy in the 60s.
Yeah, and John, I don't know if this is the quote you're thinking of with Bickle, but he said that one of the, I'm paraphrasing like you were, one of the main points of Revelation is the annihilation of human life, the taking of human life. And he said something this is a more close paraphrase. He said that when Jesus kills people, the blood will spatter up on his robe. And then later in the same manual, or I forget if it was a tape recording, but later in that same thing, he says that the end time overcomers, he puts different words to it, but they will be involved in this ministry. Now, I think the way he gets away with that, or tippy toes around it, at least in print, is that he talks about like 24/7 prayer. And prayer will bring in this tribulation, in which I think one of the words I heard about was like a couple of billion people will be wiped off the face of the earth. So yeah, to keep that really, really accurate, I would say I'm not quoting him directly, but I know that I've heard those kinds of things, similar things from him and his church. Okay, so I realize that this is kind of twist on words, but when I wrote it down, I put moron Nick Land, and then I said moron. Okay, moron Nick Land and the land of CCRU. So Land's CCRU is like the esoteric neo-fascist intellectual Julius Evola, who was an advisor of both Mussolini and Hitler. So his street cred is about as bad as you can go. But yeah, Evola had, what was that, Ride the Tiger? I think it was on the bestsellers list. And, he's behind the scenes pulling strings. And we'll see something pretty amazing about that in just a second. So how is this idea of a race war and all of that going to happen? Well, Land sees attacking racial minorities and Jews as a way of bringing us closer to race war, with the goal of establishing a white-dominated future. So, bringing up identity and Wesley Swift. Well, Swift, I don't know if I think he did have a doctorate where he picked it up. I don't know. Dr. Swift. So you wouldn't really put him toe-to-toe with this guy, Nick Land, or Steve Bannon, as far as intellect and being well-read, I don't think. I mean, Swift read a lot of garbage, which he then repackaged and passed on to other folks. But here's another person, Nick Land, who's he's pretty bright fellow, and he's talking the same talk about race war, something that would fuel race war. So back to Bannon. Of course, he was the former White House chief of staff under President Trump, and he's an alt-right advocate. He's been described as, quote, a deeply read and erudite observer of the American religious scene with a keen appetite for mystical thought. Yeah, that's all true. But here's for a bigger surprise. Bannon has reportedly read CCRU literature and was described by Land himself as, quote, fully enlightened and an unusually interesting politician.
You mentioned Wesley Swift's doctorate, and that's where it gets really interesting. He was trained in Life College by Amy Semple McPherson's Angelus Temple. I think it was also Philip Monson's Christian Identity School. I think maybe the combination of those two. But if you look at what was going on at Angelus Temple, and I'm certain they've changed since then, but there were a lot of white supremacy leaders that were emerging from that, and Christian identity leaders. They were fully sold on the Jewish conspiracy theory, and they were inviting key speakers like Gerald Burton Winrod to come speak at the Angelus Temple back then. So, and you know, if you look back at the history of Pentecostalism, that is significant, because even the 50th anniversary of Pentecostalism was held at the Angelus Temple. They had a significant impact on the Pentecostal world. And you can't say that all Pentecostals believe this, because they don't. But there was a period of time in which a majority did.
Yeah, and the same thing, not all people connected with Bannon or who have shown up somewhere and shaken his hand. Obviously, they're not all into this kind of stuff either. But he's got that. He's got the one hand is linking back to some really bad stuff through some of his associates and people he's promoted, while the other one reaches to more the norm of folks in the NAR. So the next thing I have is just more morons connected to Land. Well, here's one. This fellow gives instructions on just how to accelerate death and destruction, and it comes from a neo-Nazi writer named James Mason in his newsletter called Siege. Now, I really haven't traced down who reads Siege other than neo-Nazi folks. But again, he's got a connection to Nick Land, and this is a way he can pass on some of his ideas. Well, another surprise, maybe, is that this fellow, James Mason, literally promotes what he thinks is the approach, or was the approach, of Charles Manson. This brings up, what and how in the world is this even possible? Well, it comes as no surprise, since they corresponded with each other while Manson was in prison. And the murders committed by Manson and his Manson family, to Mason, they serve as a model of decentralized violent action that would be hard for authorities to stop. So think about these lone wolf type attacks, and who's behind the strings of that? Who were they listening to? And sometimes extremely hard to trace it down. But there's this trickle down kind of effect, sort of like what you're talking about, Pentecostals who studied in the Amy Semple McPherson's doctorate mill to get their education. So according to this guy, Mason, he says if neo-Nazis would follow Manson's example, they could start a race war, accelerate, again, that word accelerate, the pace of a societal collapse, and then set up what they think would be a replacement of today's society by a Fourth Reich. Well, there you're in the really the deep end of the pool. But again, it's being passed around by these folks that are sort of intellectuals. And so even this idea that you might have heard, the great replacement idea and the theory of white genocide, a lot of these ideas have a accelerationist component.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the new Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. We keep bouncing back and forth between me taking your ideas and you taking mine. But the neo-Nazis, I didn't cover it deeply in the book, but I did mention it. The history of what developed into the American neo-Nazi parties and the Aryan nations, for example. All of that has a direct trail all the way back to Wesley Swift. And you can follow that timeline. And in fact, in the trail of history that leads to that, one of the leaders, which was Gerald Burton Wenrod's son, he was part of the the National States Rights Party, which is a white supremacist right-wing political nut job. He had a P.O. box here in Jeffersonville, Indiana, where William Branham's home church was. And that was where it was originally headquartered in Jeffersonville, which gets really crazy when you think of all of the significance of that. But there's a trail that leads there. And you've probably seen it on the comments on my feed, but anytime I mention anything to do with what happened at the Capitol or the president who shall not be named, they say that, no, there's no connection, that was extremists, and you can't blame the rest of the people for what the extremists are doing, which is partially true. But what I am quick to point out is there's that trail of history that leads back to the origins of the NAR and the origins of the extremists at January 6th have a significant intersection. And in fact, it's more than an intersection. This was common belief among a lot of people back at the time of this intersection. So it was what evolved into the extremism. The really scary part for me, Steve, is that the rhetoric that was used to build the emotions that created the extremists is the same exact rhetoric that's used today in the NAR, even though, it may not have developed into people carrying AK-47s yet. They're saying the same exact things that did develop into this back in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, scary is a good word there because people tell me sometimes to say, "Oh, you don't really think that these guys are going to have a race war?" I think it does matter, but I think that's not the part that matters. The part that matters to me is that anybody, like I said, a lone wolf type person would take deadly action or attempt to take deadly action based on these sorts of beliefs, which, as you rightly pointed out, you can't say it's identical. To me, it's like playing whack-a-mole. Part of it crops up here, you whack that, then it comes up here, then it renames itself. Then you have all these tendrils, interconnected influences of who influenced to who. Well, we can probably say that that for the most part, the latter-rain version, the neo-Pentecostal version, the Manifest Sons of God, latter-rain, all that influenced by Jane Lee, would not be folks that you'd generally say are New Age or influenced by science fiction. However, you might have heard of this one, John, since you have an interest in science fiction. There was a novel written by Roger Zelazny called Lord of Light. And this actually influenced Nick Land, and we heard what I was saying about him. So Sam is one of the main characters in this book, but he's known by many other names. Now, here's something that people have heard about New Age stuff. He's also known as Maitreya, which is the Christ in a lot of New Age teachings, and the Lord of Light, another way to express this, the Christ of Alice Bailey's New Age teachings. So there's another character in the book, Kali. Well, she's the goddess of destruction, and she's actually based on the Hindu goddess of the same name. And anybody who's listening, if you got youngsters around, you might want to get them out of the way, put something over their ears. Kali, in a lot of neo-Gnostic writings, is considered, quote, the sacred whore, Prunukos. And she is willing to, quote, love all who bring her gifts of chaos. Okay, so chaos, that can take us in a lot of directions, especially if you've heard or read anything that I've written about Alexander Dugin. Rather than the logos, say like Christ, he has the dark logos. They like that word dark. And for him, he calls it chaos. And if you look at Alexander Dugin's writings, you can see why he calls it the dark logos. So anyway, what would some of the levels of chaos be that this movement would unleash if they had even the chance to attempt to? Well, taking a step slightly backwards, I would quote somebody on this. Now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds. This comes from a Hindu writing called the Bhagavad Gita. It was also quoted by Robert Oppenheimer, considered the father of the atomic bomb. And this was in response to the first time that he witnessed this testing. He described it in several ways, but one was it was like the radiance of 1,000 suns. Well, connecting that back to this New Age writer, Alice Bailey, she actually says in her writings that atomic bombs can be used in the future to police what she thinks of as rogue nations that don't cooperate with this leader, the Christ, and his new world religion, as she puts it.
All of which makes for a great Marvel movie if you like the Avengers and Thanos, which I do, but it doesn't have really a setting in church. This is not, that's the problem. In some of the other podcasts I'm doing, we're examining some really odd stuff, and one of them we're talking about the deliverance ministries. It's very much like the Harry Potter of Christianity, right? But they've taken these themes that aren't Christian and they create religious beliefs off of it. And that's really the point of this podcast that we're doing. It is the converging apostasy. The reason why the Marvel movies have these themes is because they were popular pagan ideas. If you go back and you study the ancient Greek and Roman religions, you're going to find all of the themes that developed into very exciting Marvel movies. But it's not something that should be in a Christian church. And I was telling Charles, I feel kind of stupid as an adult telling other adults that we shouldn't go to church to be playing Harry Potter. That's not what we do at church. But the destroyer of worlds, man. The fact that, I grew up in a doomsday cult. The Branhamism, latter rain was a doomsday cult. And when you grow up in that mindset, you are expecting a God that does not care for human life and a good versus evil scenario that the Greek and Roman gods and mythologies had. They've carried that forward into these movements. Now carry it past William Branham into the latter rain, from the latter rain into the NAR. It's the same thing, but now they're adding science fiction, Hollywood themes. The converging apostasy converges even further with modern ideas. And again, none of it is Christian. None of it really has a place in a church.
Yeah, John, I'm glad you harped on that word convergence, which of course is the main theme of my book, one of really the main themes. Because, people will sometimes unrightly say that all this stuff is coming from right-wing, alt-right folks and white supremacists, and others will say, no, it's a leftist kind of thing. Well, it's actually, it's a convergence of that. And if you read in my book, The Converging Apostasy, you'll see quite a lot of evidence for that. So to me, you can loosely say that New Age is sort of on the left, which most of them would agree with that. Alice Bailey sorts of stuff. And then on the right, of course, you got the folks that were influenced by Jane Lead coming on through to William Branham and his impact on latter rain folks, and then the subsequent influence on the NAR, those trails. So, but as the folks that I'm going to list now and some of their basic ideas, they all talk about the desire to bring about this destruction of the old order and bring in the new order. But if you listen to them carefully, you'll see that some of them are from the right and some of them are from the left, but they are sort of converging in the middle. So the first one is to repeat the name Steve Bannon. I can't find this lately, but John, I bet you could hunt this down, your research abilities. But I'm quite sure that I read in an interview once that Bannon said that he was actually a leftist and a Leninist at heart who wants to tear down all political systems. That's interesting, considering the folks he hangs out with. And he becomes quite a pragmatist and a propagandist, just to take advantage of whatever's stirring in the populist moment and steering it this way or steering it that way. But yeah, him admitting, and I'm pretty sure, I am sure that there was I forgot what the name of the journalist was, but they were with him somewhere. Maybe it was a party or a dinner function. And it was one of those off the cuff, off the record sorts of comments that Bannon made about being a leftist to this reporter. But evidently, just for accuracy's sake, the statement remains, and it's in the record. So another one is which I mentioned before, and I mentioned him in my book under From Russia with Love, ? He's the Russian intellectual and neo-Gnostic Alexander Dugin. Some people have called him something like a Vladimir Putin whisperer, because he's sort of the talk behind the throne and the influence. And so if you go deeper into Alexander Dugin, you can see not only does he have connections with the alt-right, another one who has connections, but he's another one that promotes this idea of bringing all things together. I think he calls it the fourth way, in which all things political, spiritual, and so on will converge. So here's what he also said. He said that glory, that's his exact word, comes with the return of the angels and the destruction of the world. That's bizarre. So this is why some people call him omnicidal, because he not only wants to, judge the evil and set up the kingdom, he literally thinks that the destruction of the world is the goal at hand. Well, it's not really great to have that and be influential to a man like Vladimir Putin. You can kind of read between the lines there. And next comes something that I found in a Gnostic writing, not really sure of the authorship, but it was called On the Origin of the World. And people might have heard me say before that in Gnostic writings like that of Valentinus, Sophia is considered a goddess, and she's portrayed in what evangelicals would probably consider a very Lucifer-like way. So what does she say in this On the Origin of the World? She says that that she will be the ultimate destroyer of this material universe. then she will cast them, the Jews, down into the abyss, where they will be obliterated because of their wickedness. So anybody on the left who's into the sort of pseudo neo-Gnostic kind of thoughts, thinking of, oh, it's all like love and unicorns and rainbows, etc. Well, if you dig deep to, folks that are really influential, like Valentinus and these sorts of writings, you find out there's another path that leads into this Nick Land-like stuff. So another person who fits this category is the neo-Gnostic intellectual, who I've read some of his writings, but he's also, go figure, a Holocaust denier. His name is John Lamb Lash. So, fitting with his neo-Gnostic perspective, he says that Sophia is the true Lucifer. And he says something very pleasing to her, other than an annihilation, which he talks about, is any effort to bring Russia and the United States together. And then finally, there's another person who's been influenced by Blavatsky. That is the German occultist Rudolf Steiner, who has been described as broadly educated in both the sciences and philosophy. But again, even though he's an intellectual, he also predicted a global race war between Aryans and non-whites.
While you were talking, I looked up the Steve Bannon quote, and it's talking about the comparisons between Steve Bannon and between John Lennon. And Bannon explains, I would like to bring everything crashing down and destroy all of today's establishment. And I really wish, I wish we had recorded this podcast before I published the book, because that quote would have made it. It goes with the exact theme I'm building up to. Because if you think about the NAR 7 Mountain Mandate, which all sounds really good until if you're a logical thinker and you think it out to its likely conclusion, there are many different outcomes that could happen should they try to enact the 7 Mountain Mandate. But the most likely result of this would be exactly what Steve Bannon is pushing for: topple all of the world systems and appoint leaders who are controlled and manipulated by the NAR prophets and apostles. And I know that if you're indoctrinated and you're in the NAR, you're going to think, no, that's not it. But if you follow what they say all the way out to its conclusion, that is the only way that it could work. So what Steve Bannon is saying appeals greatly to the NAR.
Yeah, John, I knew you were quick with the trigger finger, and I'm glad that you were very, very quick and found that reference, which I'll note and put it back in my research. So, yeah, and again, tying back into the NAR, I'm just thinking about this, some of the outright alt-right phrases that you will hear. So like the NAR, like Jane Lead, like Rick Joyner and Mike Bickle, apocalypse, or the end, or the sacred purge, to them, it can be controlled through human efforts. In other words, like the pseudo-intellectual accelerationist, it can be brought about. They can make it happen. So this in the NAR, under the influence of folks like, say, Bill Hammond, this would be carrying out the written judgments of God. That's one of his favorite go-tos. And in New Age writings, and those influenced by them, and also in Nick Land, you hear this, they talk about the Kali Yuga, which is the age of destruction, which brings in the New Age of enlightenment and their leadership. So you have this thirst for annihilation with these folks. To them, like the quote I made earlier of Dugin, it releases man. It's a glorious moment. He goes down with a blaze of light and glory to the destruction of the universe. But in some of these writings, it's also a return to the source, and that can be kind of vague, but they're essentially talking about a divine presence. And it can be a return to the divine pre-existent cloud of witnesses, which, as we talked about before, are often associated with the Shekinah, The only thing that I could throw in there to make that a little bit more cogent is that you have folks like Bill Britton, who in one way tried to tippy-toe around some of the more problematic doctrines of the latter rain that he was already a part of. But he made this big thing about where is heaven? He asks this rhetorically in one of his books. Then he says, essentially, it's not the where, who is heaven? So he says that it's the people, the cloud of witnesses, that's heaven. Well, let's go and think about that. Well, heaven is supposed to descend and fill the body of Christ here on earth. Well, then you have something that is really, really lined up with esoteric thought, where there's supposed to be this union between individuals in the heavenlies and the body of Christ here. And so there, again, it's like a big weave going from here and there, but you're going from Bill Britton pretty much into Aleister Crowley, opening up this channel for beings to come into to the earthly realm. And for Alice Bailey, she would say that's the externalization of the hierarchy coming down to bring about all these changes and make mankind divine. But with Lead, it's just very odd when people say that she is this or she's not this. Lead said so much of this part of taking control. She called it the spoils of the Gentiles. Okay, sure sounds like NAR talk to me. And then, of course, she had the kind of an interesting component between, or contrast between universal salvation. So everybody's going to get in on this. And yeah, but whoops, some folks are going to have to be removed because they're not really up to snuff. And that idea does go all the way back to Valentinus, where he's got these three categories, which we've talked about before, John. And they show up with George Warnock, one of the more influential folks for the latter rain, who influenced the NAR also. So for me to just wrap this up, rather than having all this stuff scattered around, to pull it together, I have this kind of question in mind. Will the NAR find a Steve Bannon-ish or an actual Steve Bannon on the alt-right to accelerate any of this stuff we're talking about, which is destruction, sacred purge, race war, any of that kind of idea?
It's not a question that I'm going to answer, but if you follow what they're saying out to its logical conclusion, and then picture people who might be mentally unstable and decide to enact the things that they're preaching, I would say it is a very strong possibility that it could. That's as far as I'll take it. But it's so scary when you think about it, Steve. These are Christian churches, and they're weaponizing the religion to turn the people into a military, and they're even using military language, Joel's Army, for example. And I had another, I don't think this one has come out yet, but I've had another person that I interviewed from the NAR, and they were required to wear dog tags. I mean, that was part of their church. I don't even call it church. That was part of their play acting that they they did under the name of Christianity, under the disguise of it.
Wow.
And that's really wrong, man. This is taking things to new levels, and I think that if the ministers do not change, it's going to turn into a bigger mess than we can possibly imagine. Yeah,
John, that is scary. Something on the lighter note is I was actually watching before this podcast a show. I forgot the name of it, but it's basically some guys in Las Vegas, and it's a pawn shop. And so people are bringing all kinds of interesting things. And today, somebody brought in something that they said they were going to sell it. It's from the actual set of Star Wars, from the Death Star. And the guy wanted $25,000 and the guy he was selling it to says, well, I don't think we can give you that. But he asked, what do you want that for? And he says, well, I know a guy who's got the original what is it, the Falcon, whatever.
Millennium Falcon.
Yeah, somebody had the original one. He says, if I get this 25,000, I'll be able to buy that. So yeah, I would say that even though he wants to spend $25,000, he's got his feet on the ground much more so than these dangerous folks we're talking about.
Yeah, Steve, I'm a big Seinfeld fan, and somebody told me one day that in every episode of Seinfeld there is a Superman, which sounds a lot cooler than it is if you actually know what it is. On the refrigerator there is a poster or a pin-up of Superman, and that is what they call the Superman. Well, in every episode of this podcast, there is a Millennium Falcon, which is right here. My wife gave me for Christmas one day this set of paintings, but that's my claim to Star Wars fame.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, anyway, we're having fun if you can't tell, so hopefully you are too. If you've enjoyed the show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. And for more information about the dark side of the NAR, you can read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and soon to be Audible. For more information about the Converging Apostasy, you can read the book The Converging Apostasy. You can also read the book A Quick Outline of Hands-on Eschatology, A Matter of Timing and Agency.